December 1942. Over the Solomon Islands. The bomber's hull trembles like a living thing. Every rivet, every panel hums in rhythm with 4 Wright Cyclone engines fighting the tropical air. Inside the waste compartment of a B-17 Flying Fortress, a 19-year-old gunner leans into his Browning M2. The weapon shudders against his gloves, the smell of burnt oil filling the narrow space. Out the left window, a thin silver shape flashes across the sun-fast, small, and lethal. A Japanese Zero. He tracks it, breath ragged inside the oxygen mask. Crosshairs on target, finger on trigger, then the thunder begins. 50 caliber rounds tear through the air, a chain of red tracers arcing beautifully useless across the sky. Every bullet sails behind the fighter's tail. The Zero never even jerks away. It glides past untouched, disappearing into the glare. The gunner's heart sinks. He did everything right, and still nothing. That moment wasn't rare. It was the rule. Across the Pacific and Europe in 1942, thousands of American and British gunners faced the same cruel truth. They were missing. They were brave, determined, well-trained, and still their rounds vanished into empty air. The problem won courage. It was physics. The invisible enemy, deflection. To hit a moving aircraft in the sky, you must shoot not at it, but ahead of it. It sounds simple, but in practice, it defies every instinct a human being has. When you're scared, you aim at what you can see. Your eyes lock on the threat, your hands follow. On the ground that works, on a rifle range, even on a deer hunt, you aim at the visible target and the bullet arrives in time. But aerial combat was different. The enemy was 20 meters away. It was 300 yards out, moving faster than any machine the world had ever built. A Japanese Zero cruising at 300 miles per hour covers 440 feet every second. A 50 caliber bullet leaves the Browning M2 at roughly 2,900 feet per second. At a 300-yard shot 900 feet, the bullet takes about 0.31 seconds to reach that space. In that tiny fraction of time, the Zero travels another 136 feet forward, about 11 car lengths. If the gunner aims directly at the aircraft, his bullets pass cleanly behind. He must instead fire into what looks like empty sky, trusting the fighter will fly into his stream of rounds. That is called deflection shooting, and it broke more minds than it did enemy aircraft. The 4% problem. Early analyses of gun camera footage in 1943 revealed how bad things really were. Trained aerial gunners scored hit rates below 5% against crossing targets. 5 out of every 100 rounds found their mark. 95 slammed into nothing. A typical engagement lasted perhaps 10 seconds. At 800 rounds per minute, 13 rounds per second, a gunner could pour 130 bullets toward the enemy. At a 5% hit rate, maybe 6 would connect. 6 hits of 50 caliber weren't always enough to bring down a sturdy FW-190 or Chi 43. The mathematics were merciless. So were the losses. In the autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force flew deep into Germany. On October 14th, the second raid on Schweinfurt No. 91 B-17s took off. 60 never came home. More than 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. Many of those bombers went down not because their crews lacked bravery, but because they simply could not shoot effectively enough to keep the enemy away. Training manuals still spoke in the language of rifle ranges: breathe, squeeze, maintain sight picture. But at 25,000 feet, with flak bursting outside and fighters crossing the formation at 400 miles per hour, marksmanship became a mathematical puzzle far beyond human reaction time. The bullet obeyed physics, the brain obeyed instinct, and instinct was losing the war. By early 1943, the air war had become a brutal equation written in men and metal. Every daylight bombing mission meant another column of smoke on the horizon. The numbers told the story with pitiless clarity. For every 1,000 bomber crewmen who climbed into their aircraft, fewer than 700 would complete a tour of duty alive. The others would vanish over France, Belgium, or the North Sea. In the debriefing rooms of England's airfields, frustrated gunners replayed the same story again and again. They saw the enemy, fired correctly, and watched the tracers curve behind their targets. They described the experience like trying to punch a ghost. It was lack of training. They'd memorized every procedure. It wasn't fear. Most were too numb to feel much of anything by their 5th or 6th mission. It was simply that the training itself had been wrong. Flexible gunnery schools had sprung up in Texas, Arizona, and Florida in 1942. The course lasted 4 weeks. Recruits studied diagrams of target angles, practiced on wooden mock-ups, and fired at toed cloth sleeves moving in gentle arcs behind slow aircraft. Those sleeves crawled along at maybe 150 miles per hour, half the speed of a German fighter. The result was an illusion of mastery. On graduation day, an instructor would slap a trainee's shoulder and say, "You're ready for combat." 2 months later, that same graduate might be gone, shot down on his second mission. The system wasn't malicious. It was simply behind the pace of technology. Between 1918 and 1941, aircraft speeds had tripled. Aerial gunnery methods had changed it all. The U.S. Army Air Forces finally began to grasp the depth of the problem after Schweinfurt. Intelligence officers examined gun camera film, damage reports, and ammunition logs. The findings were grimly consistent. The average bomber expended over 1,000 rounds of ammunition for every confirmed kill. Ammunition weighed more than armor. Wasted bullets meant less protection. The equation was unsustainable. Something fundamental had to change, not the weapons, but the way humans aimed them. The British breakthrough. Across the Atlantic, the Royal Air Force had already faced the same crisis 2 years earlier. In 1940, during the Battle of Britain, RAF Spitfire and Hurricane pilots discovered that hitting a crossing Messerschmitt was almost impossibly difficult. Their 303 caliber machine guns spat long bursts that lit up the sky but rarely struck home. Average hit rates hovered between 5 and 8%, sometimes less. Britain's survival depended on improving that number. The solution began not in the cockpit, but in a laboratory. At Farnborough, engineers led by Frederick W. Hill and Sidney Cotton experimented with a new idea, gyro-stabilized gunsight that could calculate the required lead automatically. The concept was elegant. Measure how fast the target moved across the pilot's view, combine that with its estimated range, and project a moving aiming point, the spot where bullets would actually meet the target. By late 1943, this device had matured into the Gyro Gunsight MKY and MEMK2. It used spinning gyroscopes and simple optics to solve equations that no pilot could manage in his head. During test flights, hit probabilities against crossing targets tripled. Veteran aces who had once relied on instinct now trusted a glowing reticle that danced in front of the enemy aircraft. It felt like magic, but it was just physics mechanized. When American observers from the 8th Air Force visited Farnborough, they immediately recognized the implications. If a gunsight could do the math, pilots and gunners could focus on flying and surviving instead of calculating. Within months, the British design inspired a U.S. variant, the K-14 computing gunsight, manufactured by the Sperry Gyroscope Company under the guidance of engineers from MIT's Radiation Laboratory, the same lab secretly developing radar and fire control systems under Dr. Charles Stark Draper. The American version pushed the concept further. The K-14 and its naval cousin, the Mk-18, took the pilot's range estimate and the target's angular velocity, then continuously adjusted a projected ring of light on the reflector glass. Keep the enemy plane centered within the ring, and the computer did the rest. Early tests at the Naval Air Station Norfolk in August 1943 stunned the evaluators. Pilots who had averaged 5% hits now scored nearly 20% on their first day using the gyro sight. After a week of practice, some exceeded 25. That meant each short burst of fire was suddenly decisive instead of desperate. Production ramped up through 1944, but mass installation across the bomber and fighter fleets took time. Thousands of air crews still flew with primitive iron sights, facing the Luftwaffe with nothing but guesswork and courage. Yet the seed of change had been planted. For the first time, technology was catching up to the speeds of war. Technology alone could not save the airmen. The gyro sights were brilliant, but most gunners still stared through plain glass and crossed wires. To survive, they had to retrain their minds as much as their hands. By 1944, the Army, Air Forces, and the Navy completely overhauled their gunnery programs. Training that once lasted 4 weeks now stretched to 10. 1,000 practice rounds became 5,000. The change was just about volume. It was about realism. At the Naval Air Gunner School in Jacksonville, Florida, instructors mounted Browning M2s on motorized turrets that spun and tilted in all directions. Out over the Gulf, high-speed boats towed small canvas targets, zigzagging at 60 miles per hour. Trainees fired 50 to 70 passes a day. The idea was simple: repetition until instinct took over. No lectures about trigonometry, no blackboard formula, just action and feedback. You fired, you missed, you adjusted, you fired again. Within weeks, even inexperienced recruits began to feel something shift. They stopped thinking and started reacting. The lead, once a conscious calculation, became muscle memory. The human brain, it turned out, could learn to predict motion the same way a baseball player tracks a fly ball without equations, without thought. In England, the 8th Air Force established advanced schools at Lavenham and Framlingham, embedding psychologists to study how stress affected aim. They discovered a phenomenon they called threat fixation. As an enemy fighter closed in, the gunner's focus narrowed until all he saw was the threat. Every nerve screamed shoot now. Under that pressure, all training collapsed. Gunners began pulling the trigger too early, aiming directly at the oncoming aircraft instead of leading it. Their own instincts betrayed them. The only cure was overtraining. So much repetition that the correct motion bypassed conscious thought entirely. In martial arts, the Japanese called it mushin, the no-mind state. By late 1944, elite gunners began to display it. In gun camera footage, their tracers no longer swung wildly across the frame. They opened fire at precisely the right instant, and enemy aircraft flew directly into their streams of bullets. These were the survivorsmen who had lived through 20, 30, sometimes 50 missions. They'd learned to fight both the enemy and their own fear. By mid-1944, bomber formations were no longer uniform lines of rookies. They were patchworks of experience. A veteran gunner on one aircraft could mean the difference between life and death for the crews flying beside him. When a formation came under attack, German pilots watched for it, searching for the ships whose tracers were wild and hesitant. Those bombers died first. The formations that fought back with immediate disciplined fire often survived intact. 8th Air Force loss rates began to fall. In October 1943, average bomber losses had been above 5% per mission. By July 1944, that figure had dropped to barely 3%. It doesn't sound like much, But across hundreds of sorties, it meant thousands of men who came home instead of vanishing into the clouds over Europe. Even so, the margin for error remained razor-thin. At 25,000 feet, a gunner had seconds to act. Every mission blurred into a cycle of terror, noise, and vibration. Hydraulic fluid dripped from bullet holes, oxygen masks froze solid, and the smell of cordite hung thick in the air. In those moments, the world shrank to the circle of a gun sight and the movement of a single enemy wingtip. When they returned to base, debriefings were clinical. Target engaged, fire opened, results unobserved. But behind those words lay exhaustion and an understanding that survival wasn't random anymore. It was trained, learned, earned. While gunners trained in the field, engineers continued to refine the machines that would one day make their instincts obsolete. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Dr. Charles Stark Draper's team worked inside a facility officially known as the Radiation Laboratory. The name was deliberate misdirection. There was no radiation research inside. The lab was developing the world's first computing fire control systems. Draper's principle was simple. The human brain was too slow for modern combat, so build a machine that could think faster. His group created the Mark 14 and later Mark 18 Gunsight's mechanical analog computers made of spinning gyroscopes, gears, and cams. They solved deflection equations continuously, 30 times a second. When the gunner tracked a target smoothly for 2 seconds, the sight measured its angular velocity and projected a glowing dot where the bullets would meet. All he had to do was fire at the dot. In testing at Norfolk, new trainees using the Mark 14 immediately achieved hit rates of 18%, more than triple the manual average. After a week of practice, some exceeded 25%. What the human mind could barely grasp, the machine handled effortlessly. The problem was scale. By the time production ramped up in 1944, tens of thousands of bombers were already in service. Most couldn't be retrofitted quickly enough. So while engineers celebrated their elegant solution, ordinary gunners still fought the old-fashioned way, with reflexes, discipline, and luck. Training made men better. It also killed many of them before the lessons took hold. To create one veteran gunner required months, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and often the sacrifice of those who didn't live long enough to finish the course. The Air Forces calculated it grimly. To train 50,000 new gunners in 6 months, they had to accept that most would never reach full proficiency before flying combat. The system produced conscious, competent shootersmen who knew what to do but couldn't yet do it instinctively. Under fire, they reverted to old habits. That's why the war's statistics look so strange. Within a single formation, performance could vary wildly. 2 bombers flying side by side could face identical attacks, one riddled with holes, the other untouched, simply because one crew had more experience. In gun camera film, you can see it. The confident bursts that meet a diving FW-190 head-on, the others spraying hopelessly behind. But by late 1944, something remarkable had happened. The combined power of technology and training had begun to close the gap. American and British gunners were now scoring consistent hits. The Luftwaffe, once confident in its superiority, was bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them. The defenders of Europe's skies had learned to aim not at what they saw, but at what would soon exist. By 1945, the great air armadas that once filled the European skies had become unstoppable. The same formations that had been slaughtered in 1943 were now reaching their targets and returning home. B-17s and B-24s still fell, but fewer each month. The difference wasn't armor or luck, it was knowledge. Thousands of airmen had learned to ignore what their eyes told them and trust the invisible math that ruled the sky. In every turret, from the plexiglass nose to the cramped ball under the belly, the lesson was the same. Aim where the target will be, not where it is. That simple rule, once so unnatural, became instinct, and that instinct changed the future of warfare. From gyros to computers. When the war ended, Dr. Charles Stark Draper and his team didn't stop. Their analog fire control computers evolved into the digital systems of the jet age. By the 1950s, the Mark 18 gunsight had become standard across Navy aircraft. By Korea, the concept had matured further. The A1CM computing sight, and later the Lead Computing Optical Sight, LCOS, could solve dozens of ballistic variables instantly. The pilot no longer aimed, he guided, and the system predicted. In Vietnam, the F-4 Phantom's radar-assisted gunsight performed in microseconds what Draper's mechanical gears had done 30 years earlier. Deflection, once an art, was now a line of code. When pilots squeezed the trigger, computers decided where the bullets should go. The age of intuition had become the age of automation. Yet even as technology advanced, the underlying truth never changed. Whether the weapon was a .50 caliber machine gun or a supersonic missile, the math was the same. Targets move, time passes, and the projectile must lead. Missiles simply did what gunners once struggled to do. They calculated continuously. The AIM-120 AMRAAM, the Sidewinder, even naval defense systems like the Phalanx CIWS all follow that principle. Their onboard processors perform millions of tiny deflection calculations every second, predicting where the target will be in the next heartbeat and steering toward it. When a Phalanx system fires, it spits 75 rounds a second, each guided by radar data adjusting in real time. It's the same idea that once haunted those waste gunners over Europe now. The machine never blinks, never hesitates, never aims too late. The human equation. Still, there's something about those early gunners that no machine can replicate. They learned the hard way by missing, by surviving, by trusting equations they couldn't see. Their experience built the bridge between instinct and intelligence. In late 1944, military psychologists observed veteran crews and realized something profound. The best gunners weren't thinking about physics anymore. They had merged with it. Their hands, eyes, and reflexes had internalized the laws of motion. They no longer fought against human nature. They had rewritten it. This transformation was confined to the air. The same logic of prediction shaped every field that followed: naval gunnery, tank fire control, even video games decades later. A young player learning War Thunder or Digital Combat Simulator goes through the same frustration as those 1942 airmen, tracers slipping behind a moving target, until one day, suddenly, the brain clicks and the lead feels right. The physics haven't changed, only the interface. The lesson. If you strip away the machinery, the story of deflection is about adaptation. It's about human beings confronted with the limits of instinct, forced to evolve under pressure. The sky of 1943 punished hesitation, punished intuition, punished everything that made sense on the ground. To survive, airmen had to abandon what felt natural and trust what was true. The first step was disbelief. You want me to aim at nothing? The second was faith. If I keep firing there, maybe hell fly into it. The last was understanding. He always does. That understanding cost thousands of lives, but it reshaped the future. It taught engineers how to build systems that think faster than fear, and it taught generations of soldiers and scientists that physics, not instinct, decides who survives. When you see a modern interceptor streak into the sky or an automated gun tracking a missile, you're seeing the same principle that once echoed in the thin air above Europe, the need to lead the target. The math that once killed bombers now protects cities. In the last months of the war, Allied dominance was complete. B-17s roamed the skies with little opposition. Inside those aircraft, the gunners still watched for specks on the horizon, still felt the vibration of the Brownings beneath their hands. But something had changed. When they saw an enemy fighter flash across the sun, they no longer froze. They led. They trusted the physics, fired into the empty air, and the tracers met metal. One of the surviving aces of the 8th Air Force described it years later. At first, you fight your instincts. Later, your instincts fight for you. That is the true legacy of aerial gunnery. Not the machines, not the weapons, but the transformation of the human mind under fire. A 19-year-old who once missed every shot learned to aim at nothing and hit everything. The sky didn't change. We did.